Welcome to all of you. I'm very glad to see all of you and people from all over. Um, I'm Lawrence Kurmayer. I direct the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry here at McGill. And this is part of our Thursday afternoon speaker series, which covers different topics and global mental health, culture, mind, and brain, culture and clinic. And this particular series, under the broad rubric of culture and community mental health, this year is a joint project with the Department of Anthropology and Psychiatry, looking at the politics of psychic life. And I will turn it over then to Dr. Laliberté and Collieu to introduce the session.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. So this is the last talk of the Politics of Psychic Life speaker series that has been going on since September. And after its success, hopefully it's the last talk of the first edition of the Politics of Psychic Life speaker series. And through our various speakers this year, we have traveled to Russia, Haiti, El Salvador, India, and other places, always attuned to the local ways in which psychic life is not only influenced by the environment, but more fundamentally how it emerged out of its various entanglement with other people, non-human entities, environment, atmosphere, technology, and as we'll see perhaps today, the city as a whole. And today I have the immense pleasure of presenting you Professor Michele Lancione. He is a professor of economic and political geography at the Polytechnic University of Turin. Michele Lancione has done a really original and fascinating work on homelessness, precarity, and the city. He both studies the social world and is actively engaged in transforming it through various social engagement. He is the editor of the Radical Housing Journal. He is also a documentary filmmaker and has done a movie called It Started Raining. It's free online. And if you allow me, Professor Lancione, I will put it on the website in the chat. I'll put the website in the chat. It's about the eviction of a group of Roma people in Bucharest. Finally, I will add that I invited Professor Lancione because his insight on homelessness in the city has been tremendously relevant for my own work. And also his whole work is a source of inspiration for me. And I thought that his reflection would be appreciated in the context of this series. So without further ado, I lend the microphone to Professor Lancione.
Thank you so much, Vincent, and Lawrence too, and all your colleagues for having me today. It's an immense pleasure. Usually people say it's an immense pleasure to be here, but actually, you know, it's an immense pleasure to be among you because I'm in my bedroom at this moment. I'm not really there with you, but in a sense I am. So it's I'm very happy. It's a bit of a funny talk, this one for me, because literally 5 minutes ago, my wife told me, are you doing a talk right now? This is usually time you go to bed. And so if my performance is not going to be the best, you will excuse me. I had a couple of very, very interesting exchanges with Vincent, and also a very good chat a few months ago. You know, I just want to say it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I hope to get some critical insights on the work I'm going to present today. So this is a work I haven't yet published. It's part of a book project I've been working on since a few years, and will bring us, all of us, to Bucharest, which is a city I've spent a bit of time thinking about and living in the past 5 to 6 years. So I will just share my screen so you can look at my presentation. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Great. So I will start this thing. So you know, I'm Italian, but I've spent the last 13, 15 years in the UK. And one thing that the UK did to me, unfortunately, is kind of irreversible now. It made me read my presentations. So before, you know, when I started being an academic in the UK, I was going, you know, without reading, but now I just can't do it anymore. So I will read a paper to you. And the paper is called Planning as Dispossession, Abstracting Race and Class Through the Bloc. So I will just start now. For the best part of 2015, I spent most of my mornings in an area called Livesilor in Bucharest. At the one end of that street was a shipping container, which had been converted into an harm reduction center for intravenous drug users. It was called Caracuda. On the other side lay a number of nei familisti blocks, socialist units that were designed as temporary accommodation for the nuclear families of workers who migrated to the city to work in nearby factories in the mid-60s and 70s. Over succeeding decades, they had turned into what the media called a ghetto de miserie saracie sciboli, a wrecked urban periphery filled with poor Roma people and outdoor drug consumption. Raluca, the woman I'm going to introduce you to, was living in and out of these blocks. I first met her on a journey throughout the inner and outer spaces of Ferentari, the neighborhood in the southwest of Bucharest where Alea Livesilor is located. Bogdan, a friend and peer educator in Caracuda, used to walk with me around the neighborhood, telling me its history and the story of its inhabitants. To paraphrase Abdulmalik Simon, these were storylines about who was buying what from whom and under what circumstances. That day, we were walking by the pipes of the teleheating system. These huge pipes, 1.5 meters in diameter, form one of the unofficial outer border of Ferentari. Though they run underground through much of the city, but in Ferentari they emerge for about 1 kilometer, a huge concrete-clad infrastructure about 2 meters above the earth. On our left was the remnant of an abandoned Fabbrica de Macchini. On the right, an area of urban scrap full of litter, lemne de periesti bustieni pentru tot. And in between the pillars holding up the pipes were dozens of tents, benefiting from the heat emanating from the pipes above them. These are the same pipes that provide life underground too, as I have explored in another bit of this ethnographic work on Bucharest, related to homeless people living under the main train station of the city in Gara de North. A few dozen meters in front of us, a woman was sitting on the curb. She was thin, short, and she clutched a mobile phone with a long trinket attached to it. She was wearing a black perforated blouse on top of a short pink skirt. We were smoking, and before she could finish asking us for a cigarette, Bogdan was giving her a light. He asked if she was okay, if she had condoms, if the street was calm. Short, pointed questions to which she replied with short, pointed answers. She looked at me, but we did not speak. When we were out of earshot, Bogdan told me about sex work in the area and about how women like Raluca were suffered a threefold burden. They were addicted to heroin and legale, essentially methadone. They were sex workers and they were Roma. The only other time I met Raluca was 1 or 2 weeks after this episode. That morning, I was in the quartier alone, talking to the people I knew in the area. When I reached the drug harm reduction center, neither Bogdan nor the doctor were there yet. The only one there was Raluca, waiting just a few meters away, squatting on the ground near the fence that separated the sidewalk from the small public park behind the center. That was the first time I saw her in Caracuda, and I knew she wasn't a client of the drug program. She must have obtained her syringes and condom elsewhere, maybe directly from her dealer. And so I approached her. Ce faci aici? What are you doing here? I asked. She raised her head slowly and said softly, Sunt rau, feeling bad. The violent history of dispossession and racialization of the Roma in Bucharest was exacerbated by the opening of the Balkan route in the opioid trade after 1989. Dealers initially gave away the drugs for free, seeding the market, especially in neighborhoods like Ferentari that were close to the edge of the city and already left at their own device by then. That was how Raluca and many other women and men got hooked with heroin in Ferentari and across other areas of the city too. But something more was wrong with her that morning. She was cradling her left hand, and when I asked why she wasn't feeling well, she showed me a swollen pus-seeping index finger. She was clearly in deep pain, barely able to talk or stand. And so we waited there freezing until Bogdan and the doctor came. She was medicated, cared for with the poor tools that they had to hand, while they urged her to visit an hospital immediately. She walked away holding her hand with her left hand with her right, a lighted cigarette firmly stuck in between her pinky and ring fingers. Raluca never went to the hospital. A few days later, one of Karakuda's users told us that she had been found dead under the main staircase of the Nei Familisti unit, where she used to sleep from time to time. The type of infection that probably killed her is common amongst drug users in Bucharest because, as I was able to investigate in my fieldwork, of the poor quality syringes offered by the National Drug Agency at the time. They were unsuitable for the type of injection that heroin use involves and tend to break under the skin. But Raluca couldn't have gone to the hospital even if she had wanted to. She had no medical insurance and very likely no ID either. At the margins of history and of a city that did not have space for her, her life was crossed by intersecting forms of dispossessions arising from the racialization of the Roma poor, the structural pitfalls of the Romanian welfare regime, the lack of any form of public housing policy, the instantiation of a neoliberal ideology that blames systemic social problems on individual shortcomings, and a revanchist and violent approach towards drug users. And these are all matters, of course, which are by no means typical of Romania per se, as revanchist policies against drug users and sex workers across the world clearly show. However, Raluca was also emerging through other kinds of intersections. Not only she had desires, projects, and aspirations for herself and for the family she was providing for, all of which were shattered at her death, but she was also the product of other mundane economies of life in Ferentari and the producer of similar everyday arrangements. And those go back into history and forefront into the future in ways that only an expansive and transversal approach to dispossession can appreciate. And so this paper intersects a long and well-established train of scholarship in urban studies and beyond, concerned with how planning produces and reproduces social stratas as spatial stratas and vice versa. That the urban plan is an act of power, an act of ordering and producing the other is no news. But where does the plan end in time and space in a context where very different administrative, ideological, and economic arrangements come to the fore with great power and urgency and are then scrapped away radically in the relatively short time of less than a generation? To account for the power geometries, so to speak, of today's Bucharest, an expansive reading of how its urban developments and therefore its plans have been assembled through these fast-paced years is crucial. This is a matter of time because today's uneven makings needs to be situated at a minimum in the last 150 years of the city and the country. And this is also a matter of space because that time has been assembled through a varied set of institutional arrangements, ideologies, and political economies that have produced multiple forms and functions of the urban and of its subjects. Here we are confronted with a city that moves from being an extension of the Ottoman Empire to national capital of the emergent nationalist and fascist for a very good while, Romania, to laboratory of social government and planning, to beacon of a self-declared modern, dynamic, high-tech European state. This broadly brushed periodicization correspond to very different ideologies, political economies, and biopolitics of the urban. One might argue this is not a problem posed just by Bucharest. To encompass this problem, it would be enough to root the analysis in the available periodicization structured around key codified event: the end of the empire, the birth of the nation, the rise of communism, the transition, which allow the urban historian and critical analyst to situate and narrate the city's governance of different struggles and change in the past few decades. Arguably, this is how much of the history of the so-called post-socialist cities and countries has been presented in urban studies and beyond it, producing erasures that have affected both how cities are read and their status as a post-socialist other within the field of study. But what if one does not only wants, but needs, politically and scholarly so, to account for that which cuts across these times and spaces to productively endure, not as something emerging unscattered from history, but as a longer genealogy, a transversal kind of abstraction of a collective subject from and through history? What if the available periodicization at the same time explain, but also obscure, and need therefore to be integrated with more nuanced processual takes on the makings and unmakings of uneven urban development in the city? In other words, what about the ways in which land, titles, frameworks of negotiation, as well as embodied experiences have maintained an edge of continuity across the very discontinuous history of the city of Bucharest? In this kind of exploration, I am inspired by the works of Romanian colleagues like Nico Vince, Liviu Kelcea, Veda Popovici, Ioana Florea, Adrian Deoanca, but also scholars like Anania Roy, Hakar Kotef, Judith Butler, Athena Athanasiou, or US-based scholars like looking at Romania like Erin McElroy, whom are doing much to reframe the question of dispossession, not as an event, but as a foundational, ongoing, and always situated process of the contemporary urban condition. This is also what Abdulmalik Simon writes about when he questions prevailing notions of habitability and habitability. In how Black urbanites across cities worldwide cuts through prevailing definitions of both as a way to redoing inhabitation altogether, and therefore of resisting and not simply enduring dispossession too. When it comes to my investigation of Bucharest, I want to hold together and expand on these concerns. The first is attentive to the peculiarity of local histories. The second focuses on the making of structural violences. And the third on how the previous two are inhabited and rearranged from the ground. Such an effort requires reconsideration of some of the available conceptual tools. Most notably, in the context of post-socialist cities, one needs to expand on racial capitalism in order to unpack the dynamics of dispossession of the Roma in Bucharest at times in which anti-capitalism was not only an intention, but a state and a social project. On the light of these intentions, I choose to speak of planning as dispossession to propose a tripartite move. First, to embrace in the conceptual grammar itself the now established idea that dispossession is at the core of possession itself, and therefore also to indicate that the counter-political move needs to break through that couplet. Second, and related to this, as a way to signal that planning and dispossession are not the same thing. Planning can be as dispossession, but also as something else. The endurance of its becoming as dispossession lies in its alignment to the liberal project Athanasiou and Butler have lucidly critiqued, but we can also have a different plan. Third, to recenter planning and the plan as a wider form of cartography, of a relational kind of becoming that encompasses the remit of what the state and market agents do when they do urban, regional, and national planning. Planning here, in my understanding, is not simply the project. It is a cartography of bodies, affects, and politics that are explicitly or even implicitly all together in a sense of direction or becoming. In other words, planning as dispossession can form even in those cases in which inclusion and not punishment is the main goal of states' agencies. In understanding planning as dispossession as a diagram encompassing contemporary capitalism in Bucharest, I want to define a much deeper logic of dwelling in and therefore producing the city and its subjects. Once again, the planning here in this conceptual grammar is not only what is done by those holding power, but is the assemblage of affective and political economies that, aligned in a certain way, diagrammed in a certain manner, allow for a particular affirmation of life and inhabitation to perdure and to be reproduced through time and space. The plan is therefore an iterative collective baseline that includes the formality of state and urban planning, but also other intersections that are sometimes only interstitial or untouched by the formal urban plan, and yet concur with it to the formation of spaces and experiences. In a sense, I understand the plan by its sense of direction, not its declaration. Following Tadiar, planning becomes the only partially formed and formalized arrangement through which, and here I'm quoting, contemporary contradiction between state and capital, nation and state are resolved, put to use, and toward ends that only exacerbate the inequalities of our time. My thesis is that Bucharest's contemporary urban contradictions, such as overpopulation, urban growth, management of social inequalities, city identity, and the idea of futurity, have been resolved through a number of discontinuous, yet at the same time continuous, takes on the racialized Roma other. These planned resolutions are often unspoken, unannounced, and sometimes not really planned for in the conventional sense of the term. And yet, they are there, producing years of racial violence in Bucharest, embodied in the everyday city life across its time and spaces. So I can't really present all the material I'm working on in a limited time in any meaningful way. So I just want to give you a few insights. In Ferentari, my starting point are the blocks where Raluca grew up and ended up dying. These blocks don't come from nowhere, obviously, but are inscribed in the particular urban form that Ferentari took since its inception as an agricultural becoming industrial empty land in the later 19th century. In short, up to the end of the Second World War, the neighborhood was a mix of empty plots, low-tech industries, and low-rise buildings constructed, as Dominique Teodorescu recalls, in the Mahala countryside style. To some extent, it was the least urbanized areas of Bucharest, while expressing a lot of potential in terms of expansion, both for industries and residential, and it remained so up to the end of World War II, as I said. From that moment on, Bucharest's population increased steadily, essentially people moving from the impoverished countryside, looking for work and the betterment of life in the city. Indeed, Bucharest's population grew from around 1 million in 44 to 1.4 million in 66 and 1.8 in 77. At that point in time, the Socialist Republic of Romania was faced with the task of resolving, to use Tadiar's words, the intersection of a newly booming industrial sector, of its population, and of the urbanization needs of the latter. Housing for all was a key precept of the ideology of the time. But such a precept did not instantiate itself in a vacuum. Rather, it intersected a precedent history of social and racial segmentation with which the new republic had an ambiguous relationship with. As I have illustrated in another paper, the communist state did not have a clear policy on gypsies, as they called them, for many years. Throughout the 50s and 60s, this population was not even counted as part of the country's official recognized minorities, albeit being the largest one. The approach taken by the authorities was to consider Roma workers like any others, including them in the working classes, albeit that they mostly undertook low-skilled jobs. While this might initially appear inclusive, it actually both resulted from and contributed to the inability and unwillingness of the authorities to tackle the ethnic question, the racialized stigmatization of certain groups, which remained high during these years, as also Romanian scholars contend. The first official study of Roma people was undertaken by the communist government between 72 and 74 in response to the rising demographic profile of the Roma in the country. A follow-up to that study represents the first explicit attempt by the Romanian Communist Party to integrate, to use their language, Roma people into society, though this started from an assumption that their lifestyle reflected backwardness and underdevelopment. And this is the language that you can find in the original documents of the time. While during those years, the state improved living conditions for many Roma, for example, giving them access to pension, wage labor, and schooling, the perception of them as an inferior social group remained unchallenged, having become ingrained thanks to the long history of violence tracing back to their enslavement in the country. As Beck, an American anthropologist who researched Roma people in 1980s Romania, states, and here I'm quoting, "Prisoners of war were gypsies, gypsies were slaves, slaves were degenerate or flawed. Once the notion of a gypsies were less than human was accepted, the possibility that they were anything else, most certainly not contributing members of their society, was not possible." Now, I will now expand, this was just a bit of context, on the three baselines of planned dispossession I am currently investigating in Bucharest. With baseline, I understand those spatio-temporal moments in which a plan becomes a platform upon which a particular continuity of racialized dispossession is allowed to endure. The baseline, in this sense, is nothing more than a conceptual way to identify an analytic of plans. It does not mean to indicate a mastery detached from the situated makings of that plan. In other words, here my scope is not to find a singular agentic power allowing for the endurance and reproduction of systemic racism in Bucharest, but to show how a racialized logic perdures across time and space. Indicating such a cartography of power, on the other hand, does not mean to disperse responsibilities either. It is a way to avoid westernized readings of local histories, simply put, to import racial capitalism as a notion, with the clear scope to holding accountable those that have a quintessential responsibility in allowing for planned dispossession to perdure. In the conclusion, I will go back to the question of what kind of liberation might be possible when one's embrace a disillusioned and essentially pessimistic view of the capacity of the state agency to deal with systemic racism. Now, these are the three baselines that I am going to present now. The first is about the Sedinții Comitetului Executiv al Partidului Central Comunista Românesc of 1968. The second is about drugs, it's called Heroina la Pachet. And the third is about contemporary time, civilizație, modernitate și mobilier la Ikea. So let's start with the first one. The first baseline has to do with the production of the blocks of Alea Livezilor, the ones Raluca was living in, the same ones today considered a ghetto by everyone I spoke to in Bucharest, including academics. The plan here is as close as it gets to the conventional meaning of the word. To appreciate that, I want to bring you to this particular Sedinții al Comitatului Executiv al Comitatul Central al Partidului Comunist Românesc. The meeting started at 5 p.m. Prezidează tovarășul Nicolae Ceaușescu. The first ordine de zi the most important topic to be discussed on the day was previllere la nuovi tipuri delle coinze costruite in medio urbano in fonduri de stat centralizzate, which means to discuss the new urban dwellings to be constructed by the state to accommodate the new workforce coming from the countryside, of which I have already said. Up to that point, and I just want to open a bracket here to say that this archival research was made possible in collaboration with a good friend and colleague, Robert Stoiculescu from Romania, who has also published on this topic in Romania. So up to that point, the houses constructed by the state were organized in three main kinds of design, according to different levels of comfort, from 1, the most comfortable, to 3. The comfort was not only related to the space, one could have a 3-bedroom flat of comfort 3, but to the level of finishes and provided services. In this particular meeting I'm telling you about, Ceausescu and his comrades are discussing a project advanced by the Comitetul de Stat pentru Construcții, Arhitectură și Sistematizare, which essentially has been told by Ceausescu himself to find a way to construct more houses with the same amount of money allocated by the state for the years 69s and 70s. So they want to construct more social housing, spending the same money that were already allocated into the plan. The solution found by the architects is essentially to construct flats of lower comfort, introducing de facto 2 new lower level of comfort, level 4 and the Garsoniere or studio flats without kitchen and with a shared bathroom in the hallway. There are a number of important things in this meeting, some are very amusing. For instance, there is a moment in the meeting minutes, when Ceausescu says that there are hotels for people that can pay $2, some for people who can pay $10, and some for people who can pay $20, and the same should be applied to houses. So this was the logic. But the most important things for the points I am trying to make are as follows. 3 important bits. The first one is that Ceausescu explicitly says that these new flats need to be constructed in periphery areas. And I put some bits there in Romania if you happen to know the language, but essentially these are what these bits say. So first point, Ceausescu explicitly says that these new flats, Comfort 4 and Garsoniere, needs to be constructed explicitly in periphery areas. Second, the group agrees that these new flats can be constructed in derogation to the usual planning scheme. Particularly, they can be without canalization and with fewer connections with bigger streets. Remember this bit because it comes back in history, with fewer connections to bigger streets. Third, Ceausescu is adamant that they need to stop building Comfort 1 houses, the most beautiful and comfortable one, which won't be allocated anymore, but sold, and focus instead on the lower hand of the spectrum. This discussion will then become law, a series of laws actually. And for a few years in Bucharest and other major Romanian cities, the state will purposely build houses for the new working class moving from the countryside, which is composed either by small poor family unit, for which they build the Comfort 4 flats, or the so-called nei familisti, workers without families, for which the Garsoniere are 4. More than 60% of the total housing outputs of that period is for these kinds of blocks. Now, what these blocks did at the time was to provide much needed houses to newly urbanized working class. But they did also something else. They explicitly segmented the division of class amongst the working class, allocating a particular set of benefits to those with higher expertise and status, vis-à-vis lower provisionings to those filling the ranks of unskilled jobs, which were mainly in the relatively low-tech industries of the time. Given that flats were directly assigned by factories, I have found documents in which is clear the relationship between the kind of work task one performs and the kind of flat comfort one is entitled to. This segmentation does, of course, intersect with other forms of long-term discrimination, most evidently related to race. The newly urbanized Roma, often illiterate and poorly trained to work in the mechanized factories of the time, ended up receiving a disproportionate proportion of lower quality dwellings, especially, of course, in the cases in which these dwellings were the major things on offer, such as in Ferentari, such as in the periphery area where these flats were constructed. Indeed, it was right at the edge of Ferentari in Rahova where one of these dwellings was first piloted and constructed, bending the planning rules of the time. And here you can see the image of that moment in history where that first flat was constructed. Alea Livesilor, where Raluca was born and died, was populated by buildings of this kind, mostly Garsoniere and comfort floor flats. Now, post 1989, some of these flats were vacated by their occupants and some occupied by the incoming population, once again mostly Roma, living the impoverished countryside around the city. The Balkan route of opioids was opened straight after, finding in these peripheral and transitional spaces the perfect ground for newly drug markets to flourish, met by the complete lack of expertise by authority, and later on by open and blatant racism against the Saraci, the Roma poor, and their wretched lifestyle in the ghetto. Again, this is the language that you can find in the media and also in policy. Now, importantly, when one in a text, in a speech, says something, the Balkan route of opioids was opened straight after, a sentence like that can make sense only if that opening and passing through is brought back to the body, if it is brought back in conversation with the spaces and times I have just discussed. The opening of a route is the opening of relations between economic interests, state border control, but also with conditions of inhabitations and bodies and substances and flows. Such a cartography is not planned in the conventional sense of the word. There is no sedinza of the Partitul Socialista Romanește here, and still a cartography is designed, unraveled in its assemblage, and brought to life. This is a cartography where the body does not have any pleasure in injecting heroin or methadone, no more, only pain and withdrawal. It's a plane the body tries to keep together with small tricks, stealings, and half-baked jobs, with no entitlement to the Garsoniere it occupies, being constantly targeted as other and controlled violently when it passes the minimum allowed threshold of movement. Importantly, this is a storyline that does have its own orientation and tries to construct and signal a differential future for itself and for the ones it cares about. But the flow is constantly interrupted by withdrawal, lack of support, jail, and other forms of embodied precarity. What you see here is the house of Marin, a 26 years old Roma man, father of one, drug users, hustler, as Tatiana Thieme also writes about in a totally different context. We are speaking in one of the Garsoniere, the flats with lowest level of comfort in Alea Livesilor. And this is me asking to Marin, is this your room? Yeah, I live here in rent. And who is the owner here, I ask. Someone I don't know, Marin says to me, because he comes only to collect money and then he leaves. Aha, so you have a contract here, I tell him. And he says, yeah, it's an unwritten contract. And he shows it to me later. It's a piece of paper that doesn't mean anything really. And I ask him, how's life here? What are the conditions? The conditions, you can imagine how bad they are because we don't have the basic utilities, especially since I have a 4-year-old child. The conditions are not favorable. Do you have any light or running water? Yeah, I have, but it's cold. Now in this picture, just to open a bracket, you can actually see the way in which the flat was heated. That is a concrete piece of, it's a piece of concrete with a wire that passes into it. The wire is attached directly into the only socket of the flat, and it eats up the little piece of concrete that sits on the carpet, okay? Then I asked Marin, a guy who I knew well because he was coming to the Caracuda Center, what do you take? I take heroin since I was 12 years old. It's not about money, my problem, because since I am a drug user, you can imagine that I don't care about that much in my drug user life. You can't think of anything else when you get into this situation. You don't care about anything. You don't care about not being a normal person. Why? I ask him. Because you are sick, you feel bad, you are shivering and vomiting. It's an ugly life. It's a nightmare from which you cannot wake up. And where do you shoot it? Here, I ask him. Yeah, this is the problem, he says. It would be better to have specialized spaces, for instance, a center, to pay more attention to what we are doing. I wouldn't be forced anymore to shit in front of my child, and this affects me a lot. I have friends visiting me. Sometimes I trick them. Sometimes I visit mom and steal from her. Anything that crosses my mind. Right now, you'll do anything when you are sick. And where did you live before coming here? Before, he says, I lived on the street. My wife and the boy were living with my mother-in-law, but she didn't receive me also because I had caused a lot of troubles. I've stolen from them. I fought with my wife. I've hit her because of the drugs. And then they put me in jail for 2 years and 6 months for consumption and possession. Where were you, I ask, in Jilava? And he says, Jilava, Rakova, and Botoshani. How was life in there, in the prison? Ugly, 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 he says. I take this chance to tell all drug users to stay away from jail because it's an ugly life in there. And so I ask him why it's ugly. It's ugly because you're far away from your family, especially when you're feeling miserable and no one comes to see you because no one cares. You're simply all alone and no one sees you in that jail because you are not wanted. For instance, when I went to Botoshan, there were some days when I was smoking 3 times 1 cigarette. He meant the same cigarette. We smoke in the morning when I woke up, after lunch, and in the evening before sleeping. It was hard because everyone receiving a visit was checked and their packages were removed. They never got to eat food sent by their families. And besides, they were beaten and threatened to call their families home, send me money to pay my duties. And so I asked him, what do you think institutions should do for you? Well, they should create a center when we would be treated right, to have our own doctor to examine us so we won't get sick so often, to prevent us from getting sick. You have seen it already. There are all sorts of diseases, hepatitis, you don't even know. I have lots of friends who died. In the last year since legalized appeared, methadone, I think that on my Halley have died 15, 20 persons in the last 2 years. 15, 20, I ask him. I'm talking only about those from my Halley. And how do you feel right now? This is the quote on screen. In my soul, how can I feel? You can imagine that I'm not feeling good because I have this boy and I don't have the possibility of staying out of his sight to prevent him from seeing what I do. Because at some point he sees those things, and you know children these days are more curious, they're simply smart, and I don't want him to walk the same path I did. And that's it. If we had a center where we could go and not to be forced to do it at home to prevent him from seeing those things, that would be okay. I'd feel okay. The opening of the Balkan route of the Piazza de Droguri in Ferentari are not forms of state-driven racial banishment, and yet, through its absence and factual enabling of drug flows, in the early 90s, the state provided the effective cultural and material infrastructure connecting, like a hinge, a previous baseline to the next. In plain terms, the Piazza de Droguri in Ferentari is racialized because it territorializes itself on racialized bodies, reproducing their possession through dispossession, doing nothing to redesign what has come before, and therefore not breaking but reproducing racialized past and makings. If the state plan here is to leave things be and leave them flow because it is convenient and easier to control a ghetto filled with poor Roma addict bodies rather than having the problem roaming around the city, at a more profound level, at the level that transversally connects historic and spatial baselines, today's apparent lack of plans is a plan of itself, a form of governing, of reproducing and accelerating the abstraction of race and class through the bloc. The consequence is felt and lived trauma for many, but not only. It is the reaffirmation of a dispossessive logic through time and space, through mundane neglect, repressive violence, the incarceration of the poor Roma addicts Marine talks about, but also through the cyclical proposals of grand plan of humanitarian salvation, which don't go much further than European Union-backed feel-good projects, rarely touching the surfaces of these long-term racialized makings. And so enslavement, persecution, centralized planning, segmenting the workforce on the basis of class while neglecting, yet impacting on racial segmentation too, as well as drug circulation, consumption, and dealing are not the same thing, but part of the ways in which the unsettlements of dispossession have cut through history in and through the blocks of Alea Livesilor and other margins of Bucharest too. This broader choral cartography of racialized lifelines is one that cannot be solved with incremental fixes and policy making, but requires a profound alternative plan for and with the city, for and with the collective subject of its dispossessed bodies. It almost comes without saying that that is not the direction in the making. Forged on the baselines I have showed thus far, the same old story has continued in the past 2 or 3 decades too. Bucharest has worked hard to clean itself up, being ready for civilization, modernity, Europe, and now international investments and urban rebranding. This has included removing the only point of help for poor Roma drug users in Ferentari, a Karakuda center that offered help to Raluca and that was actively trying to become the first consumption room in Bucharest as per Marine's wishes, and not only Marine's wishes. This was a very common wish. That liberatory plan, though, did not assemble the collectivity around itself. It did not fit with the new diagram, the new plan for possession, crafted by the local authorities and the city at large during these days. So very briefly, let me give you a final example of where things are going right now. In 2019, the measure of Sector 5, where Ferentari is located, presented at the MIPIM, an international property event hosted in Cannes, his plan for the, and here I'm quoting, best investment opportunity in Romania, the largest urban project developed in the past 30 years in the country, 1.6 million square built area, 10,000 dwellings, 300,000 square meter office spaces to be developed, not far from where Raluca used to live. This project, devised together with the World Bank, sits within a broader envisioning of Ferentari, which include also an urban regeneration project devised in 2017 with the French embassy in Bucharest. For the most, the latter is about what to do with the poor Roma people and especially with the ghettos like Livesilor. Those ghettos, the plan says explicitly, are what is currently impeding for the full development of the neighborhood and the city. Curiously, the key area of intervention, according to the plan, has to do with viability and with the fact that most of the streets within the blocks are enclosed, angust, and not connected with other axes of traffic. A direct expression of the socialist plan which built these things in that way a baseline or two ago. The recommendation, the way the plan resolves this tension, is to expropriate, this is the language, demolish and better connect those underdeveloped pockets with the rest of the city. Which blocks needs to be demolished is left untold, but all the arrows point in the direction of the Garsoniere built in the late 60s by the Ceausescu regime. We are talking about Marin's home and the plan for the future of his kid. The Roma currently living in places like Livesilo, Zabra Justi, Jakub Andrei will be displaced. But their displacement won't be other than the further instantiation of an ongoing set of unsettlements operated within the logic of planning as dispossession. Now, in the context of post-socialist Bucharest, planning dispossession works through continuity and discontinuity. On the one hand, today's plan for possession bear a striking discontinuity with those of the recent past, both at the level of ideological framework, but also at the level of their execution and of the kind of political economy they contribute to reproduce. Without any doubt, there are essential and excruciating differences between a plan designed to house people, such as that brought to the fore by the socialist regime, and a plan explicitly designed to demolish, displace, and construct not for people, but for profit. That difference is there and must not be flattened. At the same time, however, there is also continuity across these very different times and spaces. And that continuity reside in the kind of segmentation of social class and racial trait that these plans bring to the fore through their unfolding. The problem here is not only of plans explicitly designed to exclude the Roma urban poor in Bucharest, but also of plans that, without explicitly tackling the racialized baseline they install themselves upon, actively continue its makings. Enabling such a continuity through discontinuity is not a secondary or unwanted effect. It is a nuanced enabling, yet of such a magnitude that neither the architects working with Ceausescu to the new urban plan of their time, nor the agency that disregard the trafficking of substances and then repress the addicted, nor today's accolades extracting value from land grabbing in Bucharest, could call themselves unaware of. The baseline offers a conceptual point of reference to trace the ritornellos of rationalized makings cutting through the particular constitution of the other of Bucharest today. Saying that the other is planned does not mean to deprive it of its agentic power. Rather, it means to situate the latter within the violent long-term cartography of its assemblage. It means to say that the other is a matter of possessive takes on land, urban space, and the subject assembled through those intersections. The other here is not just the Roma in its typification, but once again an entire cartography of racialized dispossession, a ritornello reverberating through the feudal, fascist, communist, transitional, and now neoliberal times of the city. A transversal reading of what it means to inhabit foundational dispossession in such a cartography is a question of how to methodologically tap into complex localized histories that have been violently resolved by narco-traffic, urban land grab, and foreign development in ways that are systematically aligned and have therefore further reinforced the trauma of Roma racialization in Bucharest. Naturally, the state is nothing more than the temporary conjunction of interest around structures of power, allowing those interests to express their ends and meet them. And so it is just normal that the wider progressive civic society of the country and of Bucharest is busy in trying to find solutions within the state machines, its institutions, its democratic affordances, to fix the Roma question, but also to fix other pressing questions of the civic area, such as corruption. That same civic society is the one that, at large, is conniving with the makings of racialized capitalism in its high-tech assemblage in cities like Cluj, for instance, and in the fold of foreign political influences and economic investments. Typical, for instance, are the humanitarian projects sponsored by big Western corporations like the Italian Enel to improve the condition of Roma in the country. But beyond the relative adjustments that some of these conjurings can bring to the fore for selected individuals and parties, at large, the planned dispossession of the Roma in the country and in Europe, as Becker shows, continue factually undisturbed. And so if there is a futurity for that otherness, it cannot be without current state of European Union provisionings and diagrams. It is the state with its local and national agencies which has sung the song of dispossession again and again, with its actuation that at times have taken the brutal form of racial banishment, at other times have fostered the reproduction of social and class segmentations, fueling racist tropes and bypassing a liberatory confrontation with the ethnic question. As I have shown already in my other works, the way forward to me is in empowering and liberating those forms of everyday resistance that are arising from the cracks of this history. As asphyxiating as it is, the cartography of these possessions sketched in this paper is not just a matter of being subject to, and here I conclude. As Ananya Roy puts it, looking at the case of Chicago in the US, there is scope for the emergence of forms of dispossessed collectivism that find the diagram of dispossession at its individualizing core. In the entanglement of dispossessed racialized cartographies outlined in this paper, which intersect surely with many other forms of structural violence too, the key question to me remains the one that you see in your screen. How are we to struggle for a desire to exist and to be free when this desire is not exactly ours, in fact, can never be exclusively ours? I believe here Butler and Artasio are speaking to this idea, this cartographic idea of racialized subject through history and space. If our desire is mediated by the collective plans we are unavoidably part of, the way forward is around the constitution of another way of planning, another way of becoming collective from the interstices of current makings. In Bucharest, there is important work done in this sense by a number of groups fighting for housing, for a radical take on Roma rights, and for the differential way of understanding, and therefore planning for, inhabitation in the city. I have expanded on those kind of makings elsewhere. It suffices to say that the task is enormous because the foundations of racialized dispossession are ingrained in modes of being and imagining the city in its everyday embodied life. A liberatory effort will have to reckon with past continuities and break from how those seem to have already diagrammed the future. So this is the thing I wanted to present today. I put some writing there just to show the fact that this intersects with other spaces in the city. The idea of the book is to speak about Ferentari, to speak about the ways in which Roma people are evicted from the city center of Bucharest. And it's also the documentary Vincent very kindly already shared with you. And also to speak about the endurance and resistance of communities of mostly Roma homeless people living underground in the main train station of Bucharest. So it's kind of this tripartite collective cartography of the city I am trying to put together. So thank you so much for your patience and time.
Thank you very much, and thanks again to Michele Lancione for today's talk.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.